My name is Alex, and this happened when I was 22. The summer after I graduated from college, everyone was taking big trips, Europe, Southeast Asia, but I wanted something different. I wanted quiet. I wanted to disappear for a bit. I found it on a site dedicated to off-grid rentals, a small weathered cabin deep in the Olympic National Forest in Washington State. The listing was sparse: no Wi-Fi, no cell service, minimal electricity from a few solar panels. The nearest town, the owner mentioned in a curt email, was a 40-minute drive on an unpaved logging road. Perfect. The first few days were idyllic. The air smelled of pine and damp earth. I read classic novels by the light of a kerosene lamp, hiked to a nearby unnamed waterfall, and slept a solid 9 hours every night. I felt the tension I hadn't even realized I was carrying drain out of me. The cabin itself was small, measuring approximately 400 square feet with a single room and a small loft for the bed. It felt sturdy, built in the 50s or 60s with thick wood walls and a stone hearth. The silence was the first thing to change. On the fourth night, I sat by the fire, writing in my journal. The usual symphony of the forest, the chirping of crickets, the rustle of wind in the canopy, the distant call of an owl was suddenly gone. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was an instant, absolute erasure of sound. It was the kind of silence that doesn't feel peaceful. It feels like a heavy blanket pressing against your eardrums. I looked up, pen frozen mid-stroke. I could hear the tiny crackle of the fire and the low, hollow thump of my own heart, and nothing else. I got up, crossed to the window, and peered out into the impenetrable blackness. I didn't see anything. No headlights, no movement, just the unnerving, absolute stillness of the woods. I told myself it was atmospheric pressure or some weird, localized weather phenomenon. I forced myself to go to the loft, and eventually I fell into a restless sleep. The silence broke just as suddenly about 3 hours later. I woke up with a gasp, not to a sound, but to the return of sound. A sudden, loud wash of forest noise that was almost overwhelming. The next morning, I shook it off. The woods can be weird, but the pattern established itself. Every evening, sometime between 10 p.m. and midnight, the silence would fall, and it would always last for exactly 3 hours. I started anticipating it. I'd watch the clock. At 11:17 p.m. on the sixth night, the cricket stopped mid-chirp. The wind seemed to hold its breath. It was during these silent hours that I started noticing things about the cabin. Small things at first. The cabin had an old-fashioned, heavy wooden latch on the front door, the kind that had to be lifted and turned to open. One silent night, I watched the latch. I was sitting maybe 10 feet away, in a chair by the hearth, the fire low. I saw the brass latch lift. It didn't move much. Just a tiny, slow millimeter, the movement almost imperceptible. But it was there. My breath caught. I stared, heart hammering. It stayed lifted for a moment, then, with the faintest tick that should have been swallowed by the sound of the wind, but wasn't, it dropped back into place. I spent the rest of that silent interval holding a small, heavy piece of firewood, staring at the door. The next day, I bolted the door. Literally. I found some heavy screws and a sturdy piece of scrap wood in a small utility closet and jury-rigged a thick horizontal brace across the width of the door. Nothing short of a battering ram was getting through that. That night, 10:55 p.m., the silence fell. The 3-hour clock was ticking. I was in the loft. The rifle I'd brought for bare safety leaned against the wall next to the bed. I was terrified, but also determined. I was not going to run. I was going to see this through. I heard it from downstairs, the sound muffled by the floorboards. Scraping. Not the sudden shocking sound of an animal, but a slow, deliberate scrape of something hard and rough against the wood floor. It started near the hearth and moved slowly toward the kitchen area. I strained my ears. The silence outside was absolute. The sounds inside the cabin, the low murmur of the solar battery inverter, the faint squeak of the house settling, felt incredibly loud, and then the scraping. It stopped at the foot of the ladder leading up to the loft. I froze. I was pressed against the furthest wall, holding my breath, my knuckles white against the rifle stock. The cabin had a window in the loft, right next to the bed. It was small, maybe a foot wide, and too high for anyone to look in easily. Suddenly, I heard a sound directly outside that window. It was a wet, heavy, slow thump, like a bag of wet dirt being dropped onto the wooden sill. Then, a new sound, one that finally broke me, a slow, rhythmic tap, tap, tap against the glass, not with a human finger. This sounded heavy, thick, and not entirely solid, like a bundle of old dead roots. It tapped 3 times, tap, tap, tap. Then the window began to slide open. The locking mechanism was a simple hook and eye, and it was pulling itself open slowly, with an awful protesting squeal of dry wood against wood. The tapping stopped. The silence of the forest outside was still total. As the gap widened, a smell drifted in. It wasn't the smell of pine or dirt or wood smoke. It was the smell of a stagnant swamp, of old moldy water, and something else. Something metallic, like old blood. I couldn't move. I was paralyzed by the smell, by the sheer audacity of the slow, careful opening of the window. Through the widening gap, the absolute blackness of the night looked different. It looked heavier, thicker, like a velvet curtain just waiting to part. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressed the muzzle of the rifle to my chest, and let out a soundless scream. I stayed like that, heart trying to claw its way out of my ribs for what felt like an eternity. When I finally risked opening my eyes, the window was still open. The smell was still there, but the tapping had stopped. I looked at the clock on my phone, which I kept charged and on airplane mode. It was 1:55 a.m. The silence was over. Immediately, the forest rushed back in. The wind, the crickets, the rustling. It was a wave of sound, and it felt like salvation. I scrambled down the ladder, grabbed my keys, and didn't even look at the door with the heavy bolt. I ran straight out the back door, leaving it open behind me, and sprinted the 50 feet to my truck. I threw it in drive, tore down the logging road, and didn't slow down until I hit the paved highway 70 miles later. I never contacted the owner. I never called the police. I don't know what I would have told them. The truck, my keys, and my phone are all I have. I left the rifle, the journals, my wallet with all my cash and ID, and all my clothes in the cabin. That was a long time ago. I've started over taking a job hundreds of miles away, and I rent a small apartment with a dozen neighbors within shouting distance. But sometimes when I'm alone in my new secure room, I think about the Olympic National Forest. I think about the heavy, awful blanket of that 3-hour silence. And I wonder what was standing at the foot of the ladder, slowly scraping its way toward me. And I wonder if it eventually got bored with the cabin and decided to follow, because sometimes late at night, I'll be sitting in my new quiet apartment and I'll hear a sound. It's always very faint. It sounds exactly like a slow, deliberate tap, tap, tap coming from the outside of my kitchen window. And I never look.